Okay, so it is 3 o'clock, so we are going to start the BAM, POW, Superhero Stories panel featuring one of our lovely guests of honor, CB Lee. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy the panel and this convention that we've all been at here, we will also be in person next year in Montreal, where you can sit in real physical chairs. You can find out more over at register.crossingscon.org. And then there is also plenty of information to be found at the info desk as well. And I'll go over some of that later. Okay, so let us get started here. So my first question for you, CB, is just kind of an overview for anyone who might be unfamiliar with your work, which unfortunately does include me, but I'm sure that will change soon. What is your experience with superhero stories? I know that you do have a series that features superheroes. So if maybe you want to give a little blurb about what it's about.
Sure. Hi, I'm CB Lee. I'm the author of the Sidekick Squad series, which is a series of novels that set in like a post-dystopian world where there are also superheroes and superpowers. So it's basically about a group of queer teens that take on a corrupt government, and they navigate having powers, they navigate crushes and go on adventures and flying robots and all sorts of shenanigans. I've also written graphic novels for the Ben 10 series, which is heroic. His powers come from alien. So yeah. I think that is a legit form of powers. Like Superman is an alien. But sure. I've got other projects in the works, but generally love writing, superheroes and fantasy and sci-fi.
That is so cool. That sounds like a really relevant series to probably most of the attendees here. So my first question, and you kind of hinted at it there, is what is a superhero story to you? What makes someone a superhero? Because there's people who have powers, there's witches, wizards, whoever, and then there's like superheroes who have powers, but you don't usually call wizards or witches superheroes. So where do you draw the line? At what point do you define it as a superhero story?
I think genre-wise, there's a bit of element of like, the blend, the line between like sci-fi and fantasy. There's like different aesthetics, right? And there's different like hard rules and soft rules and what kind of lines, what kind of Star Wars theoretically is a science fiction. Mm-hmm. However, it has a lot of fantasy elements, right? Like people with mythical swords, forces that people don't understand, a hero's journey. But in terms of like superheroes, superpowers, I think in terms of like I think just for me personally, my witches and magic, those are kind of skill sets that you have to practice at. Mm-hmm. And not that like superheroes or people who are inundated with extra abilities don't have to also practice that. But like most of those stories come with like the idea that these powers have happened to you in some way, whether you are born with them or you discover them at some point, or you fall into a vat of radioactive acid, or and so like magic in terms of like people who have magic powers, usually there's an element of, I feel like there's more of an element of agency where they're like, I'm going to go to wizarding school, or I'm going to go, I'm going to hone these powers, or maybe there's an element of, they were born with these powers. But there's what makes a superhero story to me is about that kind of theme that of like grappling with the idea that you may or may not have expected it, or maybe you have, but in terms of like, what do you do with those powers? Like, and it's usually set in a world where not most people do not have these powers, right? So in worlds where like magic is fairly common, you can expect a fair number of the population to also know magic. Mm-hmm. But in terms of superheroes, there's you're more of a minority where you're like, it's not like you can go to the library and pick up a book on like, how do I work on my powers? How do I be a good superhero? So there's fewer I think, resources. But I think the biggest, concepts of being a superhero, most superhero media grapples with like the coming into one's power, right? Whether you're
the origin story.
They've just happened. You've just been bitten by the spider. You've just been dumped in the radioactive acid. You've just, hit puberty and suddenly your powers are in full bloom. But it deals with kind of that. And I think it ties really well with young adult fiction and a lot of coming of age stories about like, how do I reckon with who I'm becoming and who do I want to be, right? So like, if you have like super strength or you can fly, like how do you use these and how does that define who you are as a person? And then you have all these ideas about like identity. I think there's an element of identity that is super strong in superhero media because, people have like that dual like identity where they're like hiding their true self or putting on a mask or putting on a costume or coming up with an alternate persona that may be actually more close to their real persona.
Yeah. Yeah, it could just be that their inner persona is finally able to come out as opposed to the way that they've had to be up until that point.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it done both ways, and I completely agree, and it's fantastic. So we have kind of a basis for what a superhero story is. So then I also want to know, how do you approach writing a superhero story? And especially when it comes to designing the superpowers, how do you prevent them from feeling overpowered? How do you prevent them from feeling really stale? Because a lot of these powers are classics that have existed for decades, like invisibility, super strength. How do you kind of create that world?
I think for me, approaching it is like, what do I like about this power and what does it say about the person wielding it and how do they choose to wield it? I think speaks a lot to the character and what the obstacles they're going to, be presented with in the course of the story. As far as my process, in the Sidekick Squad series, I used solar flares that ignited a latent gene in people. So that was the specific thing I wanted because it ties into the world itself, right? Because, after these solar flares, there was like 100 years of like disasters and political and economic upheaval. And like the world has like the borders have changed. The world is dramatically different. And so that catalyst that brought about superheroes also brought about all these huge cataclysmic changes. As far as this is just specific to my universe, but I had people who have these abilities can't use them 100% of the time. So even if you're like the strongest person in this world, they can only use their powers for like, the utmost of their powers for like about maybe 3 or 4 hours at a time, right? Mm-hmm. So they have to think about when they're using their powers and when and how much they're limited. And so different people have different levels of how much they can use their powers. And some of this is impacted by how the like local superhuman like the superhero agency has told people about like, well, you're an A class and therefore you can use your powers this much, and you're a B class and you can use your powers this much, whatever. Some people are like, I can only use my powers for 5 minutes. Doesn't matter because my power is making a blue spot appear on the wall. And so there's a lot of like for my main characters, at least, the powers they have are really not traditional, right? And so my first novel in the series, Not Your Sidekick, Jess's parents are, one has super strength and one can fly. Mm-hmm. And so those are very like expected heroic powers, right? But for Jess, when we meet her first realization is that like, I'm almost 17 years old. I haven't had any powers yet. If I don't get powers soon, I'm probably not going to have any. Mm-hmm. And yet she discovers that like, even though she can't fly, she doesn't have super strength. There's an element of like, I'm not going to spoil the first book for you, but she finds out that she does have there are powers in the world that aren't recognized as like quote unquote heroic. Some of them are a little weird, like the guy with the blue spot. Yeah. But there's also other powers that I thought of that were fun to use and how they manifested too. So things that might not be useful in a battle, right? But powers that could be incredibly useful or just entertaining.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea talking about like what causes the powers using something like a solar flare genetic mutation where it's random, and instead of it being like, well, how come all the superheroes have the same like 5 skills, instead it's like, no, if it's a true genetic mutation you could have all kinds of abilities. I think that's really fun.
Yeah, I think I have a person who like glows a little, and then I was the person who makes like
Nice.
like things slightly warm by touching them, and then I have another person who is one of the most like powerful characters, well, like is a technopath, which could be anything, right? But like anything, she can interact with technology. But that is so, it's almost incredibly overpowered, right? Because there's so much tech. However, she loses her powers in the first book. And that, okay, that is a spoiler, but I'm not telling you who it is. But I'm also, it also sets up the next 3 books, right?
Cool.
So, but it is a huge, it's a huge plot point, right? Because part of like, you know, the idea of like overpowering versus like having flaws is that like, you know, I have you know, someone who has this incredible flower, but also he's afraid of heights. I have someone who's like, who is a logistical and shrewd and clever mastermind, but she doesn't have any inherent powers herself, but her planning skills make her incredibly valuable to the team.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. So then I have an idea, a little bit of an idea of your story, and it definitely deals with teams, with superheroes grouping together to do, hopefully vanquish evil of some kind. How do you feel about the concept of like the team up and like balancing, because you've got these different characters who on their own could seem to be kind of the star of the show, but then you've got these other characters. How do you balance to be like, they've each got their own unique thing and they've each kind of got an even weight within the story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important to me as far as like just writing an ensemble, right? Because the Sidekick Squad has been always about like the power of friendship and the power of like working together as a team. And something that these characters do figure out is that, you know, when you know, and it's a recurring theme in my books that like characters who are like, no, I'm the only one who can do this. I'm like, no, it doesn't have to be. It's very like, you can ask for support. You can get support from the people around you. You can ask adults for support. You can ask your friends for support. And I wanted to create that environment where showing people that like you can be part of a team and how to, there's so many different dynamics about like what it's like working with other people who may have different opinions than you or different skill sets. And so you have to, you know, balance and complement each other.
That's awesome. The power of friendship is always one of my favorite tropes. I will never get sick of it.
Yeah, I love, that's an aspect of like, you know, as a queer person, it's important to me to show like not just like, you know, birth families or families of origin, but also like families that you choose and people that become incredibly important to you as you move through phases in your life. And so building those relationships and showing different types of relationships in those friendships and those queer platonic relationships is also really important in the series.
Yeah, I feel like another one of my questions that I had here was about superpowers as allegories. A lot of times you will see superpowers being used as kind of a metaphor for the different kinds of maybe outcasts in society because they are different. And how do you feel about the ways that superpowers can be used in that way? Are there ways that you think maybe aren't done so good? Are there ways that you enjoy seeing it in either like stories you read or the stories you write?
I think the like superpowers as metaphor is interesting, but in terms of my work, I want to move beyond the metaphor and just have like, you know, like I was a big fan of the X-Men growing up as a kid. I loved all these series, all these mutants, because there's so much in that world that felt to me as a queer person that like it was very like, you know, society has these like beliefs about who you are. You can't help but who you are. They're afraid of you. There's, you know, laws and legislations like limiting your rights. And then there's all these allegories about like not just queer people, but like other marginalized communities that like X-Men was trying to grapple with. But it was also like, oh, but it's a metaphor,
Yeah.
right? So I wanted to write a superhero series where it wasn't just a metaphor, where you could just like bam the nail on the head. It's on the page. Jess is bisexual. You know, Bells is trans. Emma is ace. Like there's very clear, like, I did not want readers to have to guess about like who these characters were, unless that was part of the character's journey, right? Like Emma's journey is about like, you know, where she fits on the aromantic and asexual spectrums. But as far as like the importance of metaphor, I think the ideas about superhero stories are like, it's valuable to like, you know, there's so many great questions you get to ask in these type of stories, like about power, about like, what does it mean to be a hero? What does it mean to be strong? How do you define that? And how are you defining yourself? And how are you like, which self is the more true self, right? When you're wearing the mask, or when, you know, who do you present when you're like in different company? And so there's elements that I think are important, but I think like, you know, if you're writing a fantasy and you're like, well, this race represents this people and this is a metaphor for racism.
Yeah.
Why, like that, okay, great. You could choose to do that. But I think it's a direct line where I want to challenge as a writer, just to be like, no, if I'm going to engage with it, I want to engage with it head on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I also definitely feel like there are instances where the metaphor can be a little too heavy-handed, and it can almost make it like you're othering whatever the minority or whatever the social class or whatever it is that you're talking about. Like, it's weird that they are what they are, instead of it being like, as it sounds like is the case with your books, the character's orientation or their ethnicity or whatever is like the normal part about them. That's just their human nature. And then it's the superpowers is what's cool and different about them, because those are all like individualized, which I definitely appreciate in stories when they don't set it up as they're strange because they're ace. Instead, it's they're strange because they can fly, and they're ace just because they're supers.
Yeah, and that's like a personal choice on my part about like writing these books, and like not having like a ton of the kind of books I wanted to read as a kid that like showed like, I want to exist in this world, but I want to be in this fantasy world. I want to be in this superhero world. I want to like, you know, go off and have a grand destiny and go on adventures. And I don't want my identity to be a source of conflict in this particular story, right? Like there's times when I think people have the right to choose what they want to engage in, and what like, because there's so many queer stories about like the trauma of that identity and the struggle about being queer. And and there's amazing, beautiful stories that unpack and deal with all of those, but those are also very, I feel like as a reader, I need to be in a certain time, place and headspace, and have the emotional spoons to deal with that. So, and there's so much fiction out there that, if I walked into a bakery and they only had chocolate chip cookies ever, I would be like, chocolate chip cookies are great, but I would also would like cookies with M&Ms, or I'd also like a gluten-free cookie or whatever. And having the choice, right? When you walk into a bookstore, you can read so many stories about so many different, like if you like, just like the sheer range of stories, like everything from like time travel to, fantasy to any genre. But in terms of like, I think, queer fiction has come a long way in the last 5-10 years, but the genre, the number of books within lots of different genres is still moving forward, right? It's still, so something that I hope to do with my books is that it's fun, there's crushes, there's flying robots, and like people's identities are a part of them, it informs who they are, but it is not like their entire story, because like each one of us, like we're all people, and as a person you are not just your identity, you are not just like one aspect. Like I'm not just Chinese and Vietnamese and queer, I'm also like I like hiking, I like kayaking, I also have a cat, and like there's lots of different aspects that make up who you are, and like what is important to you, and it's to reduce it to just like one part of you is really like dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's also just very boring. It's like, I want to know more about this person than just this one fact.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fantastic. We were getting into the really deep stuff for a little bit there, and I love it, but I'm going to try to kind of lighten it up a little bit because I think that the superhero genre, if you would consider it a genre, also lends itself to some true, like, absurdist, like, what the hell is going on situations. So I'm just curious if there is a superpower that you have either written yourself or read that just, like, blew your mind in terms of the ramifications of it in reality.
I think, and this is a concept that has appeared in multiple mediums, but I'm like the sheer power of like being able to stop time, or like make like a little time bubble where everyone else is frozen, but you're you can do whatever. I think that I don't know, that's probably appealing to me because I feel like there's never enough hours in the day. I think if I had that power, I'd probably use it mostly to sleep or to catch up on like all the things I need to do. But that idea, I really enjoyed, for example, in Brandon Sanderson's series, actually the series after the Mistborn series, there are some characters who do have this like time bubble power, but they're very limited possibilities on how to use it. But it is a very fascinating power. And there's also like there's been graphic novels and other media that show people, like mostly villains, because if you could stop time, why not do crime?
Yeah. Absolutely, it's the perfect alibi, because if someone asked where you were at any given time, you can say where you were because you were outside of time.
Yeah.
You saying that reminded me, there was a movie probably from the 90s or early 2000s called, I think, Clock Stoppers or Clock Watchers or something like that. But it was about a character who got like a magic watch. I think it was sci-fi. Got like a sci-fi watch and was able to stop time. And my little kid self was just enraptured by this concept, because it's like, I would have so many more hours in the day. I could do so many things.
Yeah, I think I remember this movie too. Was it like a little boy and he used it to like play pranks on people? Or be good at sports?
No, it was definitely more of the teen genre. I do remember that there was some kind of romance and there was some kind of like almost like a spy thing or something. I don't know if anyone in the audience knows what I'm talking about. I don't know if it was like a made for TV thing. But yeah,
it sounds like it could have been a Disney Channel movie, and
it fully could have been. Yeah, absolutely. I think I had it on VHS. I don't know. Someone just sent me a private link to the IMDb page. It is called Clock Stoppers. Thank you very much for that. I might have to go back and watch it at some point. Yeah, I think it's so interesting, the variety of different superhero stories that exist. And that's why I do kind of hesitate sometimes to call it a genre, because it almost does feel like it's more just like a trope. Like you can have a superhero story that's like a noir, or you can have it be like a romance, or you can have it be really hard like sci-fi or fantasy or something like that.
Yeah, I think any like what makes us like like a story trope is like the hero's journey, right? And this is like a person discovering more about themselves, and they go on this grand destiny thing, and that's part of like a superhero story. But if you deconstruct like the superhero mythology, like there's a lot of different ways, and there's like anti-heroes and people who are like, oh, I never wanted this, I never wanted to be the chosen one. But I think what brings people back to it as a trope, and we just say trope as like, this is a recognizable story element. There's no judgment whether it's good or bad.
Exactly.
But, I love, for example, like Spider-Man has been rebooted so many times, right? Because it's such a relatable story, right? We all relate to Peter Parker, versus like, there's other, different heroes capture the imagination for different reasons. And there's a lot that we see ourselves in someone who may or may not be like, if we're relating to them because they're the underdog, or they're an outcast, or they are,
we have a new entrant. Oh, there we go. Jessica, are you here to join us? No, she might just be hanging out.
Cool. Hey, Jess.
Go ahead.
There's the elements of what makes a superhero story, and I think that has changed a little with like the Marvel Cinematic Universe becoming such a prevalent thing in the last 10 years, because that has, you know, revitalized the genre in a different way, where now people are like, oh, well, is it a superhero if it's not a Marvel thing? And that's been, but Marvel was not, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has not definitely been, you know, definitely was not the first. And, but the concept of like, this is a character that people relate to, and, you know, going all the way back to comic books with like a serialized journey where you can follow someone.
Yeah, those are always so much fun. So I have a question here from one of our attendees. This is from Six. At what point does a superhero turn into a reckless vigilante?
I think it would depend on your world. I think on some level, there's many stories where the superheroes are always vigilantes, right? They operate outside of the law. They operate based on their own whims. They are the judge and jury, and they determine what, you know, they have these powers that are not necessarily controllable. And so, you know, depending on the story that, or the world that you're in, they're almost always vigilantes, unless there's like, you know, like in my series, they are part of like a government force already, or being controlled by the government. But as far as recklessness turns, I think that is what makes the superhero trope interesting, because it just depends on the hi Jess, on the character, right? Like, what kind of story do you want to tell? Is this person like, oh, I'm going to change the world no matter what, and I'm out here to like, doesn't matter, I you know, in order to save the world, I'm going to do whatever it takes, doesn't matter if I break the law or hurt someone, I'm going to use my powers because you know, and then the recklessness really, you know, changes depending on the character. So at what point does someone become reckless is, I think, up to you as the writer, if you're writing the story.
Yeah, it's kind of how it's framed. Obviously, it is a very, very often quoted line, but with great power comes great responsibility. It's that idea of like, just because someone has a superpower, are they obligated to use it? And should they go against the structures within society to use it just because they're doing what they think is right? And is that okay to do? Or should you maybe try to work with like the government or the authority or whoever is in charge within the story to do, I guess, what they say that you should do? Is something I've seen kind of go both ways and be framed as either a good thing or a bad thing.
Right. Like what's interesting about, like, what, you know, another thing I love about Spider-Man is that he's always your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, right? Like, he walks people to the bus stop. He like helps you carry your groceries. And he also is recognizable as like, hey, usually the vigilante comes in at a time when like the local, you know, law enforcement is not doing its job, or there are people like local people slipping through the cracks. And so, you know, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is there to like stop people from mugging, you know, this old woman or whoever. Like, you know, there's a lot of great stories within Spider-Man. And when you look beyond where superhero stories are popular, it really depends on like the different, like Batman has such a like tense relationship with Gothams, because they're like, well, you keep doing these things, but you also discovered all these things ahead of us, and we need your help, but we also don't like you. Like,
it's a grudging relationship. They don't want to have to need each other, but they end up kind of needing each other.
Yeah.
So I guess like it's a lot of times there was kind of that turn, and I think maybe Batman is a good example of this, where it's like, you can't have a superhero be just like either lawful good or even like a neutral good kind of character. Like, they have to grapple. They have to be the anti-hero. There has to be some kind of like dark twist to it. Do you think it's necessary to have there be some kind of like dark underbelly to a superhero story? Or do you think it's enough to just have it be like kind of more whimsical, or more kind of the way Marvel's done it, where it's like, oh, isn't this so cool that this person has powers, and oops, they killed some people. It's totally fine. We're just going to brush over that. Except when they don't. But a lot of times they do.
Oh gosh, I think about like the poor insurance people working in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, what do you do? Like, Captain America's shield went through your car. Like, is that covered? Is that covered under like? What if it was Thor? Like, and they're like, no, it's an act of a god. So I'm like, yes, but
literally act of God. Yeah, exactly. I would not want to live in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I would be terrified all the time.
Right. We're like, oh hey, like check on Twitter. Oh hey, looks like the Chitauri are here. Time to peace. Or like, you know, just it's gosh, wait, remind me your question.
Just basically, do you think that you need to?
Oh, if dark and gritty is necessary.
Or even just accountability. Like, do you need to show heroes being accountable for their actions, or is it just enough to have like a rollicking good time?
It depends on what kind of story you want to tell. I feel like there's room for all, like everywhere on that spectrum, right? Like, yes, be accountable for your actions. Like the Avengers, when they brought people back from the blip, that was great. But also you've uprooted a ton of like, it caused a lot of chaos, right? Like these people, you know, they have been technically dead for 5 years and now they're back with no job history, credit history, etc. And there's a lot of, you know, just, you know, oh, these characters did some murders. Who's going to account for that? And like, like as far as like the darkness and the grittiness, there's an element of, I think there was a phase in like the late 2000s, or like this was after Batman Beyond, where everyone's like, oh my gosh, we need everything to be dark and gritty, and it has to be super broody McBruderson. And like, I really like, I love a rollicking good time. Like I am here for like, to have fun and to have like, you know, cheesy names. Like the Sidekick Squad is all about like I have organizations called like the Heroes League of Heroes and the Villains Guild. And like, it's very like fun, but there's like time, you know, like kind of like, I have fun with it, but I'm also like, okay, but we're also going to talk about like, you know, imperialism. And we're also going to talk about like, you know, like these like fascist government policies. But there's, it, you know, like I said, it comes back to the kind of story you want to tell. And there's no, does it make a story good or bad? Whether you're going to, it's up to you. And there's going to be like, and also depends on your audience. Like, who are you writing for? Who do you, like, what do you want to see? Like I, you know, a movie I enjoyed last year was Harley Quinn's, Emancipation of Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
Which, yes, she is technically a villain. She has done many a murder. And yet in this movie, it is, you know, she's like, you know, trying to protect this girl, and there's like all these plot shenanigans and a lot of really great fight scenes. Did I have a good time? Yes. Was Harley held accountable for all of her actions? No, but we are still rooting for her. We're still rooting for her to like escape this abusive relationship and to like, you know, learn more about herself and you know, wear fun outfits and kick ass.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that for sure.
That's the full name of the movie.
Yes, I know. I always forget. I do think that there is a time and a place for those kind of like more grim, dark realism superhero stories. And then, yeah, there's also a time for when it's like, I just want to see people with cool powers do cool stuff. And that's for me.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, like I said, with the bakery concept, right? Like having the options and having everything be like, I want to be able to like see the full range of options and order what I want, you know, like, and I don't want everything to be just chocolate chip cookies because chocolate cookies were popular that one time. So now everyone's like, I got to make a chocolate chip cookie just like that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let me see here. So we talked about kind of a superpower that like blew your mind when you think about it. Are there any superpowers that are like your favorite to read or write, or maybe that are your least favorite to read or write? And then like what makes them that?
That is interesting. I feel like, okay, Jack Harkness and like anybody who has some sort of like immortability, when they die and they come back, are they a whole new person? do they like have, do they retain all their memories, but like does your body just like it blows my mind where I'm just like, wait, but where did you go? Like how many versions of you exist?
What does this mean?
Like the whole new Loki show makes me question, like, okay, so does that mean every single possible choice has like another, like, yes, that's a way for Marvel to play with like the multiverses and all their different, they have so many different storylines, and now they can be like, well, actually from Earth 437, we can play with this story, which, is great if you want to continue with your never-ending universe. But the, it makes, there's a lot of, I don't know, but you think too hard about any sort of superpower and you're like, what are the mechanics of this? If Peter really does have like the abilities of a spider, does he crave eating flies? Like, is that kosher? And like a fun like concept to think about is like when you think about like vampires and like, different like like how much garlic is too much garlic. Is it like an allergic reaction? Can you just never have Italian food ever again? Like what is the extent? But people engage with it in different ways. So that's part of the fun of any sort of like fantastic concept.
Yeah, I love deconstructions of superhero stories, and like a lot of times they end up being very cynical because it's like, oh, superheroes aren't all that bad. Like The Boys, the TV show The Boys is a good example of like, okay, they have these superpowers or whatever, but they're also all pretty much jerks and they're not good people. And so it's like the heroes in that instance are the people without superpowers. But I think there's something interesting about kind of pulling apart either the superpowers themselves or the superheroes and thinking about like, what toll does that take on a person? Like some of these concepts, the idea of like rapid regeneration is like, you still got your foot chopped off. How do you feel having to have your foot chopped off and then just grow back? Do you become numb to it? Do you have intense trauma from that? Like, I do find myself as I read these stories slipping into that, like, what are the consequences of these superpowers? Let me see. So I don't have that many more questions. I don't know if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question. It wasn't, I don't think, originally planned, but I'm going to say you are welcome to come up to the podium or just DM me a question if you have anything. Or if anyone else has watched Clock Stoppers, because now I'm just so curious what that movie was about. I remember so little about it. So I guess another maybe kind of path that we could take here is, when it comes to superhero stories, is there is there a way that a superhero story hasn't been done yet, or hasn't been done at least that you've seen, that you really want to see done? Maybe like a genre mashup, or like a kind of power, or just any other aspect that you wish could be out there more?
Yeah, I think there's been elements of like, I don't know, just people, like, what are all the people chilling on the streets of New York while it's being devastated by aliens, and the Avengers are just, I mean, they did have that Powerless show go on, but like I would like an Office or like Parks and Rec or like Brooklyn Nine-Nine type show set. Like you can set it in the Marvel universe, whatever, but it's just funny, and it's like people reacting to or attempting to be accountable to these like, larger than life shenanigans, but they themselves are not larger than life. But there's and also, but that there's been headway going on through that for that to be done.
I am honestly shocked that there hasn't already been some kind of, like you said, like a Brooklyn Nine-Nine-esque TV show, but set in a world with superheroes, because I feel like society on a whole is just begging for it at this point. So we do have a question in here from Emma. What are some superhero stories that inspired you, or what are some that you like or would recommend?
I really love this. So Heroine Complex by Sarah Kuhn. It's a novel series that came out. I met Sarah because both of our books came out in the same year, and we both were like, oh, you wrote Asian American superheroes. So we both were like, well, we're a genre now. But she, her superhero series. It's so much fun. It's an adult series, so it is, and they are also like the genre is romance. So it is a lot of fun. There's like monster cupcakes and demons from other portals, and I highly recommend it for people who are looking for a good time and good romances. As far as stories that have inspired me, like I said, I was heavily inspired by like X-Men when I was a child. But in terms of like stories nowadays, I think that there's a lot of like great new media coming out. Just in terms of comics, like Miles Morales, Kamala Khan. There's so many amazing works coming out every day. Also, I'm a big fan of Squirrel Girl. I don't think Marvel is like underappreciates her, but she is, she's beaten Thanos. She's also just very positive and fun.
Yeah, she's so sweet. I love when I first heard about my friend recommended Squirrel Girl to me, and I was like, what? Because I wasn't very knowledgeable about Marvel comics. I was like, I thought it was all just like gritty, like super soldier kind of characters. What do you mean there's a girl who's just like Squirrel Girl? I think that's adorable. I love her so much. Okay, so I do have another question for you, and this one is purely fun. If you could have any superpower, what would it be and why?
Oh, time bubble, of course. I could catch up on sleep. I could write an entire book and then be back and done. And
but do you think, like, would you continue to age while you're in your time bubble? Would you?
No, I would not like that.
Yeah, you have to balance. Otherwise, you're going to start aging a lot faster than everyone else around you.
So then I have to use it. If I use the time bubble, that means like 5 minutes has passed for me while other people are.
I don't know how this time magic works. I don't know if you.
All right. Well, if we get to define how the time magic works, then I would choose not to. I think it would just be really hard. I have a lot of deadlines right now and a lot of life stuff happening. So I'm just like, if everyone could just pause, let me write this book, let me finish it, and then we can keep going and like, that would be great. But alas, I don't know, time management is such a specific skill set that I, should be better about in general. But I think it would be fun to have teleportation, because then you could save so much time on traffic and just be anywhere. And then once you have teleportation, then the world automatically is so much more accessible to you.
Yeah, that would be a lot of, I think, the superpowers that people tend to say that they want are things that they want to use in their normal life. You don't often hear people be like, oh, I want to be able to shoot lasers out of my hands so that I can go and like shoot lasers at things. It's like, I just want to make my own life easier, please. Like,
I mean, if our world was populated in which like having lasers shoot out of your hand is a necessity for like self-defense, or like there's like a bajillion other people with like weird powers every day that you're like, well, I need something to compare, or like I need to compete in the battle arena of like superpowered people. But in terms of like our world as is, I was like, all right, yes, make my personal life easier. And like, I don't know, there's so many things I want to do in the world, and like, only so much time.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of superhero stories are like literal wish fulfillment. It's like, these are things that for the most part are not possible for us in our actual everyday lives. And so it's fun. It's a form of escapism. It's a form of being like, oh my God, can you imagine if you had this ability? Even though I know for me personally, I would never want to be a superhero. I think that would be way too much responsibility, and I would crumble under the pressure.
I think part of there's so like most superhero most superhero stories also take place in a world where there's like more danger and more stuff. But if I had the power to do, I would want to like inspire people with like everyday magic, like but the thing is, there people who are like obscenely rich can already do this, right? Where they're like, oh, you know what'd be funny if what'd be great if I gave this barista like $100 bill for their tip, and like I'm like, then you just make their day, right? Or like, what would be great is if like this child like who loves fairies suddenly had like a beautiful fairy garden appear in their backyard, and it's like all beautiful and curated. Or like you're on vacation and then you see a mermaid and this mermaid just like mysteriously hands you this emerald and like winks at you and like dives back into the sea. There are like real life like people who perform as mermaids, and they spend their lives training to like breathe underwater, and they have all these cool tales, and like, you know, obviously their you know, performance level and being you know, at their, you know, what they do, it's very expensive to hire a mermaid to be like, oh yes, can you just aesthetically like welcome people to my party from this tank.
Totally.
But to do it to like inspire like everyday magic in like situations would be a lot of fun, and just in like a wholesome, like positive way, like, oh, like you literally just made someone's day, or like you bought like an entire apartment complex and gave every, you know, a whole bunch of people housing, or like you know, could end world hunger.
It's interesting that you talking about that, and kind of the idea of like, in our society, having money is a kind of superpower, in that it gives you abilities that you wouldn't, that like the normal everyday man doesn't have. It's interesting that so often in superhero stories, it is the rich people who are the villains. It's always like the rich supervillain, which is very relevant to our own society. But it's like, you don't see, I don't know, I feel like Tony Stark is an example of like a character who is rich and then wasn't a good guy, and then became a good guy, and then used his wealth and his privilege for good. But yeah, it's like, I do think, even though when we were talking about allegories, you don't want to kind of go too heavy-handed with it, there is something inherently, there's an inherent commentary on society in superhero stories, which is that like, usually it's the authority, or it's the rich, or it's the people with privilege who are the bad guys, because they are using it irresponsibly, or they're using it to hurt others. I know that you mentioned you have some like guilds and like societies and kind of power structures. How did you create them? Or did you have the idea of like, oh, these are going to be like, the authority is going to be evil, of course, or are they more like neutral or good?
They're actually like, I turn it on its head, because it's hard not to do it without spoiling the entire series. But if you read book one, you know, you get the big reveal, and then the rest of the books are about mounting a resistance and fighting back against this world. But it's basically, you know, the local government in my worlds are using these specific societies to control all people with superpowers, and in turn control the rest of the civilian population. And so creating these societies is about mostly an element of like, the authorities have decided that like, this is what it means, and like, they've decided that this group of people are dangerous, and therefore like, we're going to use them as a resource for ourselves.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky line to walk. So we do have another question from Callie here. So this is kind of the opposite of an earlier question I asked you, which is, what is a superpower you wouldn't want or would be disappointed to have?
Superpowers I would not want. I guess anything that was like attached to my mood, or like I couldn't inherently control.
Yeah.
Like, I would definitely not want to Hulk out, or like want to like have any sort of power that I could only tap into if I was feeling some emotion, because then everyone knows how you feel, like, you know. And also like, it's, or like, oh, like you can turn into a cloud of water, but only when you're really sad, or like, it would be really inconvenient to be, I don't know. I think there's, or like, well, I guess if you had like power, I was thinking about like werewolves, and like, you know, you're you know, you have this transformation once, you know, according to the moon. So, but you can kind of plan for that.
Yeah, hopefully it's on a decent enough schedule that you can be like, well, I know it's coming. There's the full moon, so here we go. I know for me, telepathy, or being able to like read minds, has always horrified me, because I do not want to know what people around me are thinking, in case they are thinking bad things about me or anyone else.
That would be terrifying.
Yeah, right. Like, a lot of times the superpowers that are seen as, that are cast in a negative light, are like, I kill people when I touch them, so I can touch nobody, which obviously sucks. But I'm interested in the ways that good superpowers can also be difficult and can like people can still struggle with them, because even the idea of like flying, like that's still a scary thing, and if you can't control it, maybe you'll fall, or maybe you'll hit something, or you'll drop somebody while you're flying. Like there's still I guess upsides and downsides to
like also
power.
The human body is not made to withstand like forces of super, like we don't have feathers to protect us. Like what if you get windburn, you get your your skin will get chapped. Do you need to wear a special super suit that like protects you? Got to keep moisturized.
Yeah. Okay, so you just mentioned my next question, which is super suits. How do you feel about the concept of uniforms? And the most important question, capes or no capes?
Okay. One of what obviously there's two realms here, right? You have the enema of like no capes because it's dangerous, it's a hazard, blah, blah, blah. But to be extra, for the aesthetic, it is so aesthetic to have a cape flapping dramatically around you, especially if you're giving a monologue, especially if you're about to like do whatever. So compromise obviously is a cape that unclasps, and you can also use that as a moment. You make your dramatic entrance, like, haha, here's my cape, it's so flowy, look at me, and then you like unclasp it, and you're like Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're like, grandma, it's me, Anastasia.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like detachable cape is just such an easy answer, and I feel like Edamode should have considered that option, because it's like you just have a quick release, like you can have tearaway pants, just have a tearaway cape, and then
it's part of the like presentation. One of my favorite movies is Megamind. And it's such a fun movie, but it's so good, right? And part of his presentation, he's like, what's the difference between a villain and a supervillain? It's presentation. And like that moment is like, it's so like chef's kiss, right? And he also, that's his superpower, right? Is to be totally extra. And that's what allows him to like escape, right? Because while like the antagonist is like super distracted by this huge floating head, he takes advantage of that and then like saves, Roxanne by like, being behind a curtain.
Yeah, I love that. I love, I guess like, and I hadn't even considered this as a question to ask because I was so focused on superheroes, but you kind of can't have a superhero movie without the villain, and oftentimes the supervillain or just story in general. How do you approach the idea of having a villain or supervillain? Do you want to make them larger than life? Do you try to ground them in reality? Because a lot of times they're out there. They do evil for the sake of doing evil.
This is really fun because so like Not Your Sidekick, the main storyline, Jess doesn't think she's going to get superpowers, so she's like, I have to stand out somehow. I have to like I'm going to have to like apply to college. I don't have any experience, so she gets an internship, and then the internship turns out to be working for the town's local supervillain. And so that's when she learns about like the conspiracy and all this other stuff. But the supervillains themselves, like I think it's part of the balance of having a very compelling superhero story, because you need to have that foil, right? You need to have like a hero. Is this hero interesting if there is not someone or something interesting to oppose them, right? So like, because without the supervillain, you just have like, oh, cool powers, fun time, right? And then that just comes back to story, and like what makes the story interesting is like it can't all be fun and games. There has to be a problem. The shoe has to drop.
Yeah, and a lot of times the villain ends up being, like you said, a foil or even like a mirror for the superhero, and they end up not just having to fight the supervillain using their superpowers, but also having to kind of grapple with the things maybe that the villain shows them or tells them or makes them think about, because it's like, oh no, like either consequences of my actions or just who I am as a person, and should I be doing this, and what does this mean? I think that sometimes the very best part of a superhero story will be the villain. I know, like you mentioned Loki, and he had such a beautiful arc of like starting out as a pretty cookie cutter villain, especially in the Avengers movie, but then like especially in the comics and then in mythology, and then now in this newest story, he is really more just the mischief. He's not a villain. He's just, sometimes he's an antagonist. Sometimes he can be the hero of his own story, and he can kind of like float in between. He's very fluid. I like how do you feel about kind of the anti-hero stories, or those stories where it's like the villain gets to kind of play the hero in those instances?
I think they're fascinating. I think that like there's everyone is the hero of their own story, right? Whether someone has been cast as like the antagonist, or someone has been like, hey, when you meet someone and you meet someone in someone else's story, are you really like seeing them for who they are, right? You're only seeing them in how they interact with those people. And sometimes in a lot of media, the villain is much more interesting than the hero, and their motives are much more interesting. That which makes like stories like Venom, like Venom in the comics originally was a villain, but people emphasize with him so much that like, the writers were like, oh, people love this character, and he eats people, but he's also fascinating, and he does help people, so we're gonna turn him into a hero. So there's like, I also love the trope of like the villain becomes like the weird uncle, or like, yes, the assassin you sent to kill me is part of my found family now, or like, just the elements of who is the most interesting, compelling characters that you want to write about, and that's the story that you want to see. So it doesn't matter what powers they have or haven't had, or opportunities they may or have in that story. I think that's what's going to drive people to be interested in them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that some people have said that the concept of superhero stories is kind of like a passing fad, like the way that there was like a bunch of pirate movies and then they went away, or there was like dystopic YA fiction, and then that kind of like trailed off a little bit. I feel like superhero stories are here to stay. I feel like there's so much range, there's so many ways they can be interpreted, that I think as long as people still want to write those stories and play those stories, like people will still want to watch them. I don't think I'll ever get sick of them. I love them.
Yeah, and it comes back to like, it's just it's a story. Like, human beings love stories, right? And especially if you look at like, larger than life like characters, or like characters that like you get to explore these fantastic concepts, right? That like, people may or may not be able to juggle a full schedule, but then now you have a character who has to deal with the time bubble, right? Or and then you can use that to explore like questions about like humanity, and questions about like, what are the consequences of doing this, and what happens when people do it with, the intent to hurt others.
Yeah, exactly. So we are coming up on time now, but this was a absolutely fascinating panel. Thank you so much for coming and agreeing to talk to us about superheroes. And then if you just want to plug your Sidekick Squad series one more time for anyone to write down on their to-be-read list.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at CBLee_CBLee. The Sidekick Squad series is out now. There's Not Your Sidekick, Not Your Villain, and Not Your Backup, and Not Your Hero will be out next year, which will conclude the series. I've also written a number of other books, including A Clash of Steel, which is coming out in September, only a month away, and it is currently out for pre-order, and there's also a giveaway happening right now on Twitter. So if you head to my Twitter, I think the last thing I retweeted was about the giveaway that's going on this week.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So to wrap this up, this has been the Superhero Stories panel. If you liked this panel, we do have a Portal Fantasy panel tomorrow, and then we also have a Folklore Inspirations panel on Saturday, which I think will also have very fun kind of discussions about genre and inspirations and the way that stories can be shaped. And then as a reminder, we will be in person next year in Montreal. That's going to be in August. And then you can go to register.crossingscon.com to sign up for that. There is also a Patreon for our parent organization, which is Mfosing Enterprises. You can go to patreon.com/Mfosing. There is also, if you don't know how to spell Mfosing, there is a Sonia, what is it? Is it the little treasure chest? I can't remember which icon it is on there. But if you go to our info desk, then there will be little interactable icons that will lead you to our Patreon, our registration, and then also our merch, because we do have merch available. We have some absolutely beautiful book plates that our head of design, Amy, has created. And you can feel free to order one of those, and then you can get them signed by one of our guests of honor, and then you will be able to put them in any book that you desire. So we're going to be getting started with our next panel here, which is the Authors in Conversation. So I'm going to head off and hand it over to Sonia.